series. For those who attended the first one on labor migration last week, welcome back. For those who are new, welcome again. This one today is on race, ethnicity in migration. I think a very provocative discussion. We'll go to that in a second. Please do stay for announcements at the end. I'll come back again with some interesting surprises and a few announcements, particularly in how we will follow up these webinars, including this one today. So please do stay for that. We'll give some details about what's coming up, not just in the next webinars, but also what will follow in terms of the discussion and how we take it forward. And I think everyone will be particularly interested to stay for that to understand how you reconnect back and how we get to talk to everyone about this issue. So please do stay to the end for that. As we mentioned, today's panel on race and ethnicity is something that we thought was, of course, a priority for civil society and migration. What we're trying to do today, as you'll see from the panelists, is we're going to try to give both a global perspective, which I believe Anastasia, given her previous positions and her profile, will help to present, but also some really specific regional insights from grassroots activists and experts on the issues from a variety of different regions. So I think it's something that we try to capture when we were organizing this particular webinar. You'll notice, however, we didn't manage to capture all of the different regions, and in particular, we noted to ourselves that Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific were regions that are not directly represented on the panel today, but we are dedicated and we're committed to also explore the issues in those regions. And we'll do that either through participants in the discussion or through the follow-up, which we will, as I mentioned, we'll come back in the end and talk about how we will follow up on that. You might also notice that it's an all-woman panel, and this is by design also. Certainly, we feel that gender and race intersectionalities that are very much intertwined, especially in migration. We wanted to explore that with a strong gender lens. So we have a group of feminist leaders to be part of our panel today. So I think that's going to be very interesting as well. With that, I just want to pass it on and introduce Stella. Just take a moment for those who might not know Stella. I think that most of us know. Stella is actually from a Ford and a deputy director at the Ford, the African Foundation for Development in the UK. And Stella is one of those, alongside her colleague, Anyakachi Wambu, was one of those that actually first introduced or brought up the issue within our discussions, particularly through the regional civil society consultation for the GFMD for Europe last year, and raising this issue in the forefront, putting up the member states and talking about this at a point when maybe arguably you could say that it was even maybe taboo to talk about it. So I think we really credit Stella for raising this issue, and we've been following that up in the Civil Society Action Committee with a series of dialogues, which has inevitably led to this webinar. So we really welcome Stella. She has a lot of experience and an expert in issues of engaging diaspora, particularly the African diaspora in the UK and in Europe, particularly around issues of development in the global south and in Africa. Stella, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for being a leader on a lot of this discourse, which has been very necessary and very timely. We turn this over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you've tuned in from. And I don't think I can take all the credit for leading on some of these discussions, Colin. I think the Action Committee and other colleagues have been incredible as well with taking these discussions forward. Thanks very much and welcome everyone to our discussions today on race and ethnicity and migration. For those of you who are fasting as well at this time who have joined, thanks very much for coming on board. Just to add just a little bit more of background to the points that Colin had made. So this webinar is also, of course, it's part of a five webinar series, and it's building on the recently concluded 23-part webinar series on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And also in addition to some discussions and work that the Civil Society Action Committee subgroup on race and migration have also been participating in. and an action committee, a policy brief for civil society to address racism in global migration governance and policy. Following on from the policy brief, we've also had other discussions about how we might unpack and understand the relevance of race and migration in different geographical or regional contexts. And I think Colin was mentioning that as well earlier on, about how we plan to take these discussions forward. So this specific webinar is meant to trigger these conversations on race, and we're hoping, of course, to be able to identify some strategies to feed into the International Migration Review Forum in 2022. Our speakers will be helping us to bring into the discussions international views, specifically within the context of Asia, of Europe, of the Americas. And this, of course, as we've mentioned, is not everything, but this is where we're hoping to start the discussions today. Also, just to add that these discussions have always really been relevant. They are urgent, and quite frankly, I think the discussion on the intersection between migration and race is way overdue. This webinar and all the background work have obviously come about and perhaps are even more pertinent now as a result of the Black Lives Matter the demonstration in June, which started last year. Of course, we know that the BLM, the movement, began in 2013 in response to police brutality and racially motivated violence against Black people. And since then, of course, there have been many such. There have been a lot more of these incidents, unfortunately. But what's been of particular importance and interest is that following last year's movement in June, the globalization of the sentiments around the world has been different. It's been contextualized. It's resonated in so many different ways, not just for people of African descent or African, Black, and diaspora communities across the world, but also for the younger generation, for other races. It's cut across race lines. It's been contextualized, as we've seen in the UK, where we've had young people from different races come together to topple statues that they felt represented slavery or oppression, and they've come together to demonstrate together. It's also demonstrated Black and Asian solidarity against anti-Asian hate and violence. It's reignited discussions in Asia, in the Americas, indigenous populations, of the relevance of all of this within all of our communities. And above all, it's shed a global light on the systemic nature of racial injustices in our communities and societies, and in the work that we do in migration governance and policy. The protests have also led to whole-scale examinations of current interpersonal relations, social practices, institutional behavior, and national and global policies and frameworks that have produced inequalities and diminished the life chances of those who are seen to be less deserving because of their race and ethnicity. There's, of course, a history in each regional or geographical context that cannot be ignored. At Afford, we recognize and we talk about the historical legacies spanning 400 years since slavery of people from the African continent, and also the interconnectedness with the Caribbeans and Africa's global diaspora, and the old diaspora and the new. And right here in the UK, a recent report by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which was released at the end of March, has caused a whole load of discussions on this issue. And the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent have come out to strongly condemn this. And we will talk about this in a moment. But clearly, a lot of institutions, including our own sector on migration governance and policy, we're all on a steep learning curve on how we respond to the issues of race, ethnicity, and migration. Our speakers will discuss their perspectives and forward-looking strategies on how we progress the anti-racism agenda vis-a-vis migration in practice, migration governance, and migration policies. And we will also be very interested in getting your perspectives as well, in particular on how we move things forward, i.e. the audience's perspectives. So to start with, I would like to start with a speaker who will be able to give us the big picture, a global overview of racism and migration. Anastasia quickly is a professor emerita and former head of the Department of Applied Social Studies at Maynooth University in Ireland. She's also a former chair and was an elected member of the United Nations Treaty Supervisory Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. She's a founding member of the European Network Against Racism and has long been involved in work with travelers in Ireland through the Pavy Point, which she co-founded and chairs. She convenes the community sector subgroup of the Community Workers Cooperative and is a board member of the Migrant Rights Centre Ireland. Anastasia was the first chairperson of the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency and was personal representative of the chair in office of the OSCE on combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, which also focused on intolerance and discrimination against Christians and members of other religions from 2004 to 2008. And finally, she is currently a member of the committee charged with developing a national action plan on racism for Ireland. And she remains committed to working collectively with marginalized migrant and minority groups for rights realization and an end to racism. So as you can tell, lots of experience there in this area of work and a long history of it. So just to come to you, Anastasia, and if I can say, we just seem to be living in rather unsettled and troubling times, as we can see. Now, the link between racism and migration has long existed, but it's only now perhaps beginning to get the attention that it actually deserves. Can you, first of all, just give us a global overview on racism and migration and why you think that the connection has not been much more, has not been a lot more visible before, and why that is the case?
Thank you very much, Stella. I'm quite sure for anybody listening, you would have thought that if I had done half of what it said on the tin, none of us would need to be here today. So I have to say every single bit of it is still work in progress. Could I say, first of all, I'm very glad to be here because of my own experience as a migrant in 1970s UK and my own work with Irish immigrants during that decade throughout the UK. Most notably work with the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4 and the Maguire 7, all of whom were wrongly convicted of what were termed terrorist offences. Their wrongful convictions and the racism that was experienced by the Irish community during that decade in the UK made very, very clear to me those links that you're talking about in a very personal way between racism and migration. Very clear, I became very clear also about the process of racialization and what it meant. Indeed, those good people, virtually all of whom have now died and who were scarred for life by their imprisonment at the time, those good people, a number of them would actually have been executed. So we would have been looking at posthumous sort of pardons and reconciliation if indeed the death penalty had still existed in the UK. In my work with CERD, I was a member for 2 terms, and indeed in my work with the European Union and the work that I undertook with the OSCE in that very long title, I used to feel, to be quite honest, that by the time you'd said the title, you'd probably done enough work to last you for a day. But in all of that work, one of the things, and perhaps it was grounded in my own experience as well, I've always been very, very clear about, is that inextricable link between migration and racism. Every single country that was reviewed during the time that I was a member of CERD, for every single country that was reviewed, we raised those questions. Every single country from every part of the world, we raised those questions about racism and migration. And in every case, there were indeed challenges to be answered. I think, and those challenges, in my view, and those questions have multiplied during the past year of the pandemic globally. It seems to me, I welcome your approach, by the way, of being conscious also of some of those realities and looking for actionable ways of moving things forward. In particular, I'm conscious in the last year or two of the way in which frontline workers are considered as important, but not always is it clarified that the frontline workers in question during the pandemic in every country globally are very often migrants. And certainly not always is it clarified that frontline workers, as well as, and they do need to be acknowledged, doctors and nurses, as well as doctors and nurses include cleaners and porters, some of whom can be undocumented and a vast number of whom will also be migrants. So it seems to me, I think then my answer to your question is that those links between migration and racism have been ignored. They've been ignored for two reasons, I think. First of all, because it makes economic sense on an ongoing basis to have an army of underpaid labour who can be sort of relied on to do the work to do. But secondly, to be able to deny them the sort of citizenship or full rights that might make them full participants in the countries where they have migrated to. And thirdly, to keep them in that sort of middle sort of position of being a migrant rather than being a full citizen. I think, but there has also been, and you spoke earlier about Black Lives Matter, I think one of the key things that Black Lives Matter has done in the past year in particular is to again facilitate the naming of racism as a key toxic discourse, as a key toxic phenomenon globally, which has existed for a very long time, but which needs to be named in order to address it. For the past decade, certainly during my time as a member of CERD, I was very, very conscious of the way in which racism was sidestepped. It was called anything besides racism. And the discourse was used to sort of divide people experiencing racism, to create hierarchies of oppression, and to also create divisions which served nobody except the powerful and served to further institutionalize racism. It seems to me as well that when we begin to think about migrants and racism, we're forced to go beyond the individual experience, and we're forced to consider the systemic, the structural roots of racism and the way in which those have continued from the era of slavery and colonization, and the way in fact they were shaped by the era of slavery and colonization, and the way in which we now need to look at their current manifestations. So I think it has facilitated us to ignore those, to ignore the systemic structural dimensions which are reflected in our institutions, and then of course experienced by individuals, including migrants.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anastasia. I think you really do mention some very important points there, but I like the fact that you started off by saying that if the death penalty still existed, we probably wouldn't be having these conversations at all, in a sense. And also, I think some of the key points that you mentioned there as well, in terms of the fact that, in your view, that these discussions and the links have not been made or have been ignored, let's put it that way, due to perhaps economics, etc. But also that in the context of talking about migrants and racism, it means that institutions do have to look beyond, as you said, the individual and actually begin to look at the systemic structures. Now, I think in all of this, what I would like to take it to, of course, because it's on the one hand, I'd like to think that since the days of the death penalty, there has been some progress, and that we can talk about these discussions, that we can openly have these discussions. But on the other hand as well, just to bring it back to the reports that I had mentioned earlier, which was put out by the Commission here in the UK, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which has been condemned by the UN Experts Working Group on people of African descent. And on the one hand, we want to think that things have improved, but then I think this report, of course, has raised quite a lot of questions on that. And I just wanted to quote just one little bit from the report, or from the statements that came from the UN Working Group. So they said, in quotes, in 2021, it is stunning to read a report on race and ethnicity that repackages racist tropes and stereotypes into fact, twisting data and misapplying statistics and studies into conclusory findings and ad hominem attacks on people of African descent. So I know that you've been very vocal, and I saw a clip of you where in your role as chair of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, this was in 2017, you called on high-level politicians and went as far as directly urging the president of the US at the time to take the lead in condemning racism and violence by white supremacists. What are your views of this report that we now have in the UK? And do you think that this is a British phenomenon, or is this indicative of wider global perspectives?
I'm absolutely appalled by this report, and I fully agree with the perspective taken by the committee on the Committee on Experts of People of African Descent. I fully agree with it. I just think it's an appalling and very, very disappointing indictment of some of the good work that has gone on in the UK over the years. And yes, I'm afraid that I do think it reflects that sort of sidestepping of racism, that sort of systemic capacity to ignore structural and systemic racism, the capacity to ignore the embedded nature of the institutional racism that's faced by people in all parts of the world. I would like to say that it's just a British phenomenon, and I noted in your introduction that you said that we would be talking with people from different parts of the world, and I'm delighted to see a number of colleagues from different parts of the world on the panel, because I think this institutionalization has a different face in different parts of the world and is experienced differently by migrants in different parts of the world. One size simply does not fit all, but what is clear for all is that what we are talking about is racism. I think a number of the racialization processes that have gone on systemically over the past 5 or 6 or even more hundreds of years are very hard to dislodge. And point B, there is not the same systemic commitment to dislodging them. In fact, where they have been dislodged to some extent, I'd suggest to you, they haven't been accompanied by the sorts of special measures, by the economic and social policies which would create the conditions for full participation by migrants and by people from minorities experiencing racism. They simply have not been accompanied by them, nor have they been accompanied by the reframing of history, which is required in order to have a real perspective on the realities that have been faced by people over the years, instead of which we're faced with the inevitable sort of repeated in that report, rose-tinted spectacles about this sort of place where everybody knows their place and is happy to stay in it. Those of us involved in any struggle know that was simply never the case. It didn't exist, and it certainly doesn't exist now. Migration policy structured to exclude, and as your own very useful briefing document says, I think, and structured to respond to the needs of the economy supplied by units of labour. And I've often found, for example, looking at European Union policies, that notion of units of labour is very, very offensive. And I find it appalling that alongside the report from the UK, there's also a rather ambivalent new pact on migration and asylum being introduced in the European Union, which has the effect, which I'm sure many of the people around this webinar are more than familiar with, of sort of endorsing policies of attempting to stop people from migrating to provide essential sort of work in Europe, and in fact where they're able to say sometimes that up to 90% of people have been prohibited from coming into Europe since 2015. So it's an appalling report in a nutshell. I'm a little nervous as an old member of a national committee charged with developing a national action plan on racism in Ireland, having fought for 10 years to ensure that our country actually developed a second national action plan on racism. I'm a little nervous that we are very, very careful not to repeat anything like this plan, and that we do adopt, as we have done in our interim report, an understanding of racism which unequivocally speaks to its systemic and structural dimensions. And we're now charged with the job of trying to produce a plan that will actually begin to address those. And I use the term begin to address them deliberately.
Thank you, Anastasia. Again, you raised a really important point there. And I think one of the first things you had mentioned there, of course, was the fact that when we talk about institutional racism or institutionalization, it has a different face in different parts of the world. And absolutely, I think this is something that we are hoping that we will be able to unpack even more, even beyond this webinar today. And then, of course, the other point also about the fact that a lot of the realities of people within the race and migration space have not actually been accompanied by economic and social policies, and also the history and the legacy has also been completely ignored. I think I'd be quite keen, I suppose, to hear your view, but I think we will have to come back to this later. But to hear your view around how we continue to what strategies we will need to begin to really start to pull in this context of the historical migratory flows as we know it, and of course the ensuing legacy that it's left, and how that has, of course, transpired into the institutional racism and the inequalities as we see it the world over. And I hope that we will be able to come back to this at some point soon. I can already see quite a lot of comments in the chat, but I'm going to go next to our next speaker, Nana Gyamfi. Just to introduce Nana Gyamfi, who is the Executive Director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is the largest Black-led social justice organization representing the nearly 10 million Black immigrants, refugees, and families living in the US. A movement attorney for the past 25 years, Nana is a co-founder of Justice Warriors for Black Lives and Human Rights Advocacy, both dedicated to fighting for human rights and Black liberation. She's also served as the Executive Director of Black Women's Forum, and is a former professor in the Pan-African Studies Department at California State University in Los Angeles. She's also the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. Nana has long been a sought-after voice for legal and political insights into issues affecting Black communities, and continues to do this all very amazing work. Nana, you're welcome. Before I get into the key questions for you, I just want to, and perhaps just linking it back a little bit to some of the points Anastasia was also sharing with us around the historic legacy as well. I mean, for us, as I'd mentioned earlier, we talk about the history of the transatlantic slave trade. We understand that that in itself was a migration pattern, followed by colonialism, globalization, and then the legacy and repercussions of all of these unequal structures. On your website, this is Badgie's website, you've got this wonderful old historical picture, which shows protesters with banners campaigning for freedom in Eritrea, freedom from apartheid and imperialism in South Africa, and calling for support for the Afro-American people, as they were called at the time, in the US. And it's such a powerful image depicting the interconnectedness of Africa and its global diaspora, of people of African descent, of the old diaspora and the new diaspora. And I will come back to you with specific questions in relation to that. But to start off, I think this was something that you had mentioned about the US, the civil rights activist and organizer Fannie Lou Hamer, who famously cautioned that no one is free until Black people are free. How does combating anti-Black racism help us to combat the criminalization, exclusion, and separation of migrants, families, and communities from the work that you've been doing?
Thank you so very much, Stella, and thank you for all those who put this together. I'm so excited. First of all, let me bow to your leadership in this area, Stella. So appreciative, because these are conversations that folks just don't want to have. And often those of us that are trying to have it find ourselves really, people are looking sideways like, oh, here they go, bringing this issue up again. Not really understanding that, as our great leader and teacher, Fannie Lou Hamer, our Queen Mother, teaches us, that once we resolve the issues that result from anti-Black racism, once we look at and address the impacts of anti-Black racism, we will free everyone else, right? And as the Black feminist women of the Combahee River Collective taught us, the work of resolving the needs and aspirations of the least privileged, of the most marginalized of us, will produce liberation for everyone. And when we're talking about migration and the United States in particular, it is Black migrants, because of our Blackness, who are disproportionately in the position of the least privileged, of the most marginalized. In the US context, when we're looking at anti-Blackness as it's reflected in migration policy, even now, it's directly connected to this over 500 years of Western imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, that then, bears fruit in its most essential form as enslavement in this transatlantic slave trade, in which Black people were defined, Blackness itself was defined as chattel from the very beginning. Black people were subhuman, or defined as subhuman, even though it was clear that we are human beings. We were human beings then. We didn't transform like butterflies. We still are human beings. We're no different. And so it was clear that we are human, but there was a need in order to justify imperialism, in order to justify colonialism, in order to justify enslavement and chattel slavery in particular, to define us as subhuman. And so an entire system was created, not just the United States, but throughout the Americas in particular, in which whiteness equals humanity, whiteness equals freedom, whiteness equals human rights, human dignity, whiteness equals belonging. Whiteness is the standard. Even today, if someone says their shoes are nude, what color are they going to be? I know they're not going to be the color of my Black feet, right? The standard is whiteness. Whiteness is the citizen. Whiteness is the one that belongs and should lead the exploiter. And who are the Black people? The Black people in this system are the subhuman, the not quite human, the enslaved, the criminalized, with no rights that the white man need respect, as that famous Dred Scott case laid out in the United States by the Supreme Court. The other, the foreigner, and therefore the migrant. And there's a deep narrative that becomes a Blackness cloak that gets thrown on all other people of color that are brought into or that come into the country. And we can see that correlation between being a migrant and this cloak of Blackness, as the correlations are done in reverse. So to be migrant is to be foreign, which is to be other, which is to be enslaved. In other words, as Anastasia just talked about, exploited for profit, to be criminalized, therefore to be subhuman, and therefore not worthy of human rights or dignity. And so we can't be surprised when we look in the United States and we see that Black migrants are the most criminalized. We are disproportionate. We're 8% of the foreign-born population. We are at least 20% of those facing deportation in the immigration deportation system. We are 76% more likely to be deported based on criminal grounds. In other words, 76% of us across the board, from Black folks from the continent, the Caribbean, from Europe, right? We are 76% more likely to be deported because of criminal grounds. If you're from the Caribbean, forget about it. Trinidad and Tobago, 100% of those deported in the last numbers deported on criminal grounds. The Bahamas, Barbados, 100%. Jamaica, somewhere near 93%. Haiti, somewhere near 87%. And then even as you look across the continent of Africa, you see those same numbers, 76% and above of us are deported based on criminal grounds. Our bonds are higher, therefore we spend the longest time in detention, many of us spending up to 2-3 years in detention. They found that Black folks in detention are 6 times more likely to be held in solitary confinement. Black trans migrants face horrible discrimination. We're outside of the detention system, inside the detention system, and clearly within the deportation system. We're excluded as enslaved Africans. Were excluded from education, from wealth. 19% of Black migrants are living below the poverty line, though we are amongst the most educated immigrants that come into the United States. We're excluded from services that are connected to human rights, such as healthcare. We are separated in the ways that separation is so normal in the United States when it comes to Black people, separated from our families, separated from our communities in disproportionate numbers, whether it be by bans, by visa restrictions, or by deportation, by arrest as Black people in the United States who are routinely racially targeted, killed by police. And there's, unfortunately, a litany of cases that include our brother Botham Jean, of Black migrants who were killed by the police, just as other Black folks are killed by police in the United States. And so if we address the criminalization, the root causes of the criminalization of Black migrants, the root causes of the exclusion of Black migrants, the root causes of the separation of Black migrants from our families and communities, we will not just impact and benefit migrants across the board in the United States, but really human beings across the board, and set a new course where our policies are modern and based upon human rights and human dignity.
Nana, that was powerful. Thank you so much. I think just by bringing the statistics as well as you did, it really does bring the reality of people's life to the fore. And, you know, even for all of us, I'm sure for others on the call as well, in as much as we feel that we understand these areas, I think when we have the data and the reality of what is actually happening, it really does throw it up much, much more. I think some of the points that you've made also about the fact that there was a need, of course, to justify through slavery, through colonialism, through imperialism, there was a need to justify Black people as being subhuman. And then you take it into, which I think is really important and really relevant, going from the fact that that sort of deep narrative, as you describe it, of Blackness then becomes a cloak that then impacts on the other, right? So whoever the other is, so long as they are seen as migrants, then that cloak, they are also impacted by this as well. And then it continues, basically. In terms of how we address the root cause of all of this, as you're saying, and really begin to apply practically human rights to all of these issues and begin to heal from it and move forward. Again, just going back to some of the work that Baji is doing, where I think, and again, I've taken this from your website, about the fact that African Americans and Black immigrants from Africa, the Caribbean and Latin America, you bring different groups together to dialogue about the myths and stereotypes as well as cultural, social, and political issues that divide these communities. So I think a question around that is, within this context of our histories of migration and how we've all found ourselves to be, in different places, how do you, if we're talking about how we address the root cause and how we move things forward, what is the dialogue between the different communities, and how do we begin to take things forward together? Because clearly, if we are working, and this is part of the work that you're doing, there are obviously myths and stereotypes that actually divide the communities when we should actually be trying to work together.
Absolutely. I mean, it is part of the work that I enjoy the most. And I think part of that is because I was born in the United States. So I'm still Ghanaian, okay? Like a Toyota made in Kansas. We still from the place of origin. However, I've been at that intersection myself. I am Baji. I've been at that intersection of racial justice, right? Of Blackness and of being an immigrant. And so we see it and we know it. And I'm sure, because I have cousins in the UK, it's not so different. There's on one hand, clearly you're impacted by the Blackness, we say in Baji, and we tell our members and our community that are not multi-generational African-American, you learn how to be Black in America from African-Americans. Don't take it from whatever you saw on movies, etc. when you were home. Don't, even the history, the little bit of history you may have learned at home, you're going to learn that from African-Americans. What does it mean to be in this country? What does it mean, how do you deal with the police? What does it mean when you're being followed? Why is it that you become a person who now is not trustworthy, right? How are you having these issues at the job? So, as you indicated, I'm an attorney. I've had people come in and, they're telling me all these things that are happening at the job. And I'm like, well, this is happening to you because you're Black. And it's like, what? But I'm not Black. I'm from Ghana. It's like, yes, you are Black in America. This is not because of your accent. If you were a white person with a French accent, nobody would be complaining about your accent. This is because you are a Black person, and therefore they have racialized even your accent, right? And we have this conversation in Baji in the broader context, sitting down with Black migrants and having the conversations about how we fit. What does it mean to be Black in the United States? And having our multi-generational African-American siblings break down that conversation. But then we also provide part of the conversation, because it's easy, especially in the US, to fall into a kind of US exceptionalism, where people have a notion that what's happening to them as Black people in the United States, and especially multi-generational African-Americans, is something that was birthed out of the United States, right? And that it doesn't have this connection to the colonialism in our home countries. And so we have those conversations, those political education conversations, to link the colonialism. You don't have enslavement out of the blues. People were not transported like Star Trek. You got to have colonialism on the continent to have a position in which African people can be put into bondage, kidnapped, and dragged to the United States of America. And so once we begin to have these conversations about how anti-Black racism plays out in our home countries, because it does, as well as in the United States, and begin to talk about how we pull all of these different fights that are really fights around anti-Blackness together, then we are able to move forward and do the kinds of things that we did with civic engagement over the past couple of years, and do the kinds of things that we are doing, including the Black Lives Matter movement. As you know, Opal Tometi, who was our former ED, is one of the big three of BLM that co-founded BLM, because Baji has always been in this leading space of talking about the issues of criminalization of Black folks, of talking about the issues of exclusion of Black folks and separation of Black folks that BLM addresses, particularly with respect to police violence. So we bring folks in, we have to do that type of education and see where the root is. And when we explore the root, it becomes much easier for us to have these conversations of how we build power and move our world into the world that we want to see.
Absolutely, Nana. Thank you so much for that. I like the fact that you also brought into the discussions here the fact that there is also a discussion to be had about anti-Black in our home countries as well in itself. So it's not a secluded issue anywhere in the world, really. There really is a connectedness that is important for us to find a way to move that forward. And I think a lot of what you're saying really does point to the history and the journeys, and actually the fact that you said that in the US, you learn, regardless of where you're coming from, regardless of whether you're a new diaspora or not, you learn to be Black in the US from African Americans. So that in itself tells you that the history that we share of slavery all over, it still impacts basically the way that we live, or the way that Black people live their lives in there. There is a lot more to unpack for sure, but I'm going to move on to the next speaker. And also I'm aware that Nana has to leave about half an hour earlier. So we will try and come back to you, Nana, I'm looking in the chat boxes to see if I see any specific questions, but we will come back to you for some final words or to respond to 1 or 2 questions before you have to leave. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to link this now to our next speaker, who is Adler Shashati. Adler is a member of the steering committee of Equinox Racial Justice Initiative, the director of Greek Forum of Migrants, and a member of the Sudanese community in Greece. With more than 20 years experience in issues of migration, the fight against racism and xenophobia at national and European level. She was also representing the countries of Southern Europe in the board of the European Network Against Racism. Adler, to start off on a question for you, in Europe, we saw from last year, once the BLM, the demonstrations started around May or June, we saw the protests in Europe that cut across race lines. We saw African diaspora communities, white and Black people, young people all coming together against racism. We saw the statues that were toppled and or defaced in the UK and Belgium and France. And we've also seen a further contextualization in increasing activism calling for the return of African stolen artifacts, for example. The topic of colonialism is still a touchy subject in a number of European countries, and racism is still seen as an individual act of bad behavior rather than a structural problem. I saw this article online, which I think was written in June 2020 by a journalist called Esther King. And she was looking at Europe's response to BLM in the heat of the demonstrations. And she said, and I quote, "Being a Black or brown person in Europe means being confronted from a young age with teachings that paint colonialism as a worthy enterprise. It means you're more likely to live in poorer, heavily policed neighborhoods. It means that your job applications will often go unanswered, and you'll have a hard time renting property or buying a house." How does race factor into migration flows in Europe, from slavery to colonialism to globalization and more recent patterns in the 20th and 21st centuries of migration? Could you give us a broader perspective about migration and race in Europe? And if possible, taking into account how this impacts on integration amongst diaspora and migrant communities.
Yes, hello from me too. Good evening. It's an honor to participate in such an interesting discussion with colleagues from all around the world. It was really nice to hear Anastasia and Nana. Wow, power. The truth is that migration is a global phenomenon and it should be treated as such, but it needs a closer look at some regional and national specificities. Now I'll give you some numbers too. We have 21.8 million people, around 4.9% of the total population of the EU, who are non-EU citizens. There are citizens who do not have equal rights, for example, in political participation. Despite variations in most EU countries, migrants are not eligible to run or vote in parliamentary elections, while in the majority of EU countries, they are not entitled to local representation either. In most cases, only EU citizens have full voting rights in the country in which they are a national. All EU citizens, of course, can vote in local elections and European parliamentary elections, regardless of where they live within the EU. But third country nationals do not have that privilege. So we have freedom of expression, the freedom to form organizations, political parties, the right to strike. There are also political rights that have been granted to migrants in some, but not in all European countries. Acknowledging the fact that migration is a permanent feature of European society, the Union recognized the importance of migrant integration inclusion for social inclusion and growth more than a decade ago. I think it was in 2004 when the Council of the European Union issued a set of common basic principles for immigrant integration policy. However, despite a multitude of legal, policy, and funding instruments, these principles have only been partially implemented. The Black Lives Matter movement shed a light on the deep and widening nature of structural racism also in the European Union. As you said, we had a lot of incidents where people gathered together, they tried they brought down statutes that represented colonialism Europe. And in all aspects of the European society, from law enforcement to housing and education to migration, the EU's attention and political commitments in response to Black Lives Matter protests, including the adoption of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, are considered to be good developments. After almost a decade of limited action in the field of racial justice. And remember that we have the creation of a vice president for protecting our European way of life, which is considered offensive to Europe's racialized communities, is an implication that the European way of life is one that must be promoted over the others. However, the action undertaken will only be effective if they address structural and institutional racism and include racialized communities in such efforts, which until now they don't. This requires a significant shift in EU policy to better reflect the needs and the reality of the situation of racialized communities in Europe today. Thus, Equinox Initiative for Racial Justice, which I represent as a member of the steering committee, proposes change in 4 key areas: political commitment to racial justice, institutional change, cohesive legislation and policy on structural racism, and a new relationship with the civil society. Last but not least, especially for the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, to fully reach its potential, there must be a fuller understanding of how structural racism operates and its connection within the EU legislation, policy, and practice. Regarding now the long-awaited Pact of Migration and Asylum, on a first glance, we notice that once again, the Commission's proposal is inferior to the circumstances. This pact gives economic character to solidarity. It allows countries to refuse the acceptance of refugees and leaves the countries of entry, the countries of the South, helpless to cope on their own with the consolation of a voluntary solidarity from their allies. If you are interested more, I can upload an institutional paper that we have done with Equinox. I can put it in the chat. Can I do that?
Yes, absolutely. That would be great.
Okay.
Yes.
So I don't go into that more. And we are also going to produce something specific on race and migration. So currently we are reviewing the Migration and Asylum Pact, like all civil society organizations, in order to propose specific solutions through the networks that we're participating in, but we remain committed to our request for safe passage to Europe, safe passage for refugees, a guarantee of their rights and fair treatment by all EU member states, because we cannot and should not stand silent in the face of a plan that reinforces the racist narrative that refugees and migrants are invaders in Europe, because this is what's happening. This is what is happening. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Adler. And of course, for bringing up, of course, the points that, you know, we cannot condone the negative stereotypes and the narratives, basically, about, you know, about migrants and refugees being, as you said, invaders in Europe. I'm also, and thank you for sharing I think the document that you mentioned as well in the chat. But thanks also for raising, of course, some of the documents and the policies on migration that also exist in Europe. And I wondered whether, because I think Anastasia had mentioned it earlier, this is the EU Pact on Migration, which was released, I think, last October or so. And yes, I just wondered, yes, if you might be able, September. I wondered if you might be able to touch on that, really, in terms of what your views are on that. I think there have been a number of comments about the way that it's almost in some ways using, you could describe it almost as a carrot and stick approach. On the one hand, there's quite a lot of focus on returns, but then there is also some focus as well on labor mobility schemes. But it seems to almost be a sort of carrot and stick approach. But it would be interesting to hear what your views are on that. And then please do also feel free, if you wanted to bring a specific focus on Greece as well in relation to the discussions around race and migration.
In whatever concerns the Migration and Asylum Pact, it is, as I told you, the focus is mainly on returns. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Sorry. Yes. So the main problem in this is that it gives an economic character to solidarity, as I said, because people who are coming to Europe, the first countries who accept people, they're the ones who take all the burden in terms of what they are going to do. It is like they are putting people in the countries of entry, and they are helpless, and they have no consolation of any type of solidarity, and they're expecting this to come from
Hi, Adler. Are you still there?
To accept any migrants, so people are just staying in the camps. And there is since 2015, everyone who is coming to Europe actually comes through Greece. We have around 100,000 refugees and asylum seekers, mostly from Afghanistan, Syria, and African countries, who are currently in camps and in the mainland, and they appear to be unwanted by Europe, by most political parties, and also by the governments. We only hear about detention centers, relocation, voluntary reports, and deportation. And this is the plan, and this is the actual plan. We haven't heard anything about social inclusion, anything about human rights. And coming now to what is happening to Greece, since 2015, we are in the airtime in the media is only focusing on refugees and asylum seekers, because, of course, there is a huge issue with all those people who are trying to reach an idealized Europe. Although there is this situation, there is a lack of awareness on the issues of immigrants. There are more than 500,000 immigrants living in Greece for over 30 to 40 years now. They come from around 150 different countries of origin. And the 5 most populous communities in Greece are from Albania, Georgia, Pakistan, Ukraine, and Russia, which they work, they pay taxes, they pay their fees for residence permit, but still for the Greek state, they are invisible. They are not equal to the Greek citizens. They do not have equal rights in health, work, education. The philosophy in which all the legal regulations for the Greek migration policy are structured want the migrant to be temporary, invisible, out of the system, without social inclusion, with residence permit that must be renewed every 2, 3, or 5 years, depending on the government elected each time. And it is no coincidence that in the International Migrants Day of 2020, our demands as Greek Forum of Migrants remain the same as they were 20 years ago. Since the 90s, we have been expecting a substantial migration policy with a view to social inclusion, without discrimination, with equality and equity, because we believe that social inclusion is the only way to achieve social cohesion. Migration, migrants, people with migrant background like me have been fighting for our rights for so many years now. And some of the most important problems that we are facing at the moment, because we also have the era of COVID-19, have to do with the residence permits, have to do with the changes in income and unemployment, because a large part of people who work in the country work under very bad conditions. And during the pandemic, the ones who are undeclared, they had to be without a job because they couldn't move without reference papers. And many migrants who became unemployed, undocumented migrants, asylum seekers, or even recognized refugees are unable to find accommodation, either because they cannot afford it or because they do not find owners willing to rent their homes to foreigners. Thus, they are forced to homelessness. And one of the most vulnerable groups are currently women, because there are many reports for domestic violence where women, in addition to the violence they experience, they are also threatened by their husbands for deportation and custody of their children, because their residence permit are linked. So if they leave home or divorce them, then they're going to be without papers. We also have reports of domestic helpers in homes where their work is not declared, so they are not allowed to leave their house. There are complaints that have already been recorded by the Racist Violence Recording Network in Greece, in which there are members, the creation in the text from the municipal and the Greek police, where migrants are stopped much more often for screening. And last but not least, we are facing with issues of shutting down of migrant community centers, because migrant and refugee communities are recognized association and their main source of income is from their members and from events and other activities that have been banned due to the pandemic, which forces them to face a huge problem of economic survival. We have several communities during the pandemic that were forced to shut down temporarily as they could not afford the expenses. All these examples that I mentioned reflect a special focus in what is happening in Greece today, okay? And I'm mostly referring to the problems that people are facing, problems which I believe that can be addressed if the Greek state finally chooses the path of substantial migration policy aimed at social integration, equality, equal rights among citizens, in collaboration, of course, with the civil society and the grassroots organizations that represent migrants, and also with the help of Europe, where we see that this is not happening because the EU Pact on Migration is not actually resolving issues that it should resolve, but it's creating more issues because it is relocating people. It is only in terms of how it is structured, dealing with people who are coming and how they are going to live. And it has it is actually seeing migrants again as invaders, as people who are coming from outside, and how we're going to put them somewhere and leave them invisible there, not include them in the society, just leave them outside of the society.
Yeah. No, you've raised some really, really key issues there, Adler. And also, I think one of the key points that I think has come through from your intervention here really is even how much more dire the situation is within the context of the pandemic as well. And of course, in particular, with reference to the situation in Greece as well. I think these are, again, I think a bit like what Nana had done. I think you've also really just brought to the fore the real key sort of challenges, and the fact that a lot of the policies that are being put out there are actually not resolving the issue, but are actually making it worse. And that is also something that definitely does need to be looked at. There are some questions in the chat, which I'm just going to read them out, but I'm not going to come to you immediately for them, as I'd like to move to the next two speakers. But there's a question for Nana from Subir, which is, what has been the role of Black collectives? So if you can just note the question, please. What have been the role of Black collectives, civil society and progressive groups, apart from the BLM movement, in tackling the menace of extreme discrimination, dehumanization, and othering on the basis of color, race, and ethnicity, besides other purported reasons of discrimination? And then it's followed with a question for Adler, which is, how do the Romas fare in the EU in the scheme of things as far as engaging with the state and contesting their status and roles are concerned? So if you can both just note those questions, and I'll come back to you in a bit. There was another question earlier, or maybe more of a comment, but I thought it was an important one to make, and I will probably ask Anastasia a little bit later on perhaps to respond to this. So this was a question from Patricia McKenna-Jones, who says that I do think that here in the UK, I'm assuming CONS is conservatives, but please correct me if I'm wrong, have managed to split the working class white from their Black allies, exemplified by Brexit. It's a case of divide and rule. I grew up in a deprived area of Liverpool, getting beaten up and denied access to education alongside my Black classmates. I am white, I'm second generation Irish. Many of us socialists want to fight injustice and global inequality with you. Thank you, Patricia. That's really heartwarming, but it would be great to respond to that, and anyone else who wants to do that. But I'm going to move on from Adler. Adler, thank you so much. And Go, I'm just aware of the time now, and also the fact that I need to circle back to Nana as well. So I'm going to go straight to Pravina, who is a professor at the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, India, where she's involved in teaching and policy-oriented research. She teaches courses on gender and development and qualitative research methods to master's students and doctoral candidates. She's been involved in research on multiple dimensions of migration, the distinctive spatial and social character of overseas migration of women from South India, the intersecting gender, class, and caste dimensions of migration, both within and across India's borders, state policy, and questions of citizenship of migrant workers at the lower end of the skills hierarchy. She's written a working paper on the recruitment and migration of South Indian women domestic workers to the Middle East, based on her field research conducted between 2013 and 2019 in 2 Indian states, Andhra Pradesh and Kerala, which was published by the ILO in July 2020. And at the moment, along with her colleagues at the CDS, she's also involved in 2 research projects, a study of child migration to Kerala and Tamil Nadu for the UNICEF, and a study of an intensely immigrant village in Kerala focusing on return migration in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. Pravina, it's great to have you on board. And I think this is one conversation I was really looking forward to also start to have a discussion around the caste system in Asia, and of course within the context of what we are discussing around race, ethnicity, and migration. So I think first of all, for those of us with a limited knowledge on the system, can you explain to us what this is much more broadly, and then also how the system as a hierarchical social one has structured or impacted migration policy and practice within and across the Indian borders?
Thank you, Stella. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, loud and clear.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers also for inviting me to this really important and also very interesting panel discussion. I'm really delighted to be here. So let me begin by just making a statement about, race and caste, because there is a certain overlap between race and caste, but caste is also distinct. And the overlap really, as I see it, is in the value system that defines a history of exclusion and oppression for certain groups of people. But the distinction is that if you look at South Asians, we would be seen as one race. We would be one racial category. And caste really is a form of stratification within this one racial category. Now, it's a form of stratification, and stratification is a neutral term. It doesn't necessarily have a value system, but it's a form of stratification with hierarchy built into it. And that's where the value system comes in. And the stratification is such that we have people who are positioned at the higher end of the hierarchy, and they are endowed with privileges which are expressed in the form of a disproportionate share of property and wealth, of endowments, also of social resources like education, access to qualified professional employment, but also very rich social capital. And people or groups at the lower end of the hierarchy who are marked by their laboring people, and they're marked by their experience, their history, as well as their present and experience of oppression and of exclusion. They have far less ownership of property. They have far less education. If you look at the statistics on India, all of this is very apparent, and they have far less, far poorer social capital as well. And these are the terms really in which their experience of migration is also structured. Now, another point that I must make with respect to the oppressed castes in India is that they're not just merely laboring castes, but their labor is denigrated. And some of this labor is still subject to stigma. So the fact that they perform this labor, but this labor itself is also subject to stigma. So labor such as scavenging, and there's very little of social and spatial mobility that they have experienced even since the independence, since India achieved independence. So compared to the higher castes or the more privileged castes, so we still find that the oppressed castes are still predominant in denigrated forms of labor. So having said that, I would now like to address the question of how caste structures migration. And I'll make 3 broad points. One is that caste actually structures migration in terms of providing differentiated access to migration according to where you are positioned in the caste hierarchy. And by differentiated access, I mean that the more prized and the more privileged kinds of migration, social and spatial mobility, that is also accumulative, where you're able to actually get better in economic and social terms, is disproportionately colonized by those of the privileged caste. And those of the oppressed caste groups, people of the oppressed caste have had very little access to those kinds of migration that gives you social and spatial mobility. But when you examine the forms of migration that are circular, they do not lead to social spatial mobility, but they're circular, and they're basically survival strategies. You'll find a disproportionate share of the people who undertake that form of migration within the country, that is, are those of the oppressed castes. And this is because of lack of access to adequate means of survival, even where they are usually located. So this is a broader understanding of how caste actually structures mobility. And this understanding prevails when we look at international migration. Now, international migration in the post-independence era, and that is post-1947 for India, has actually had very little participation from the oppressed castes. And that is not surprising given the kind of conditions in which international migration is undertaken from India. International migration is premised on a certain level of endowments. Either you must be qualified to get those jobs, or you must have access to property and wealth to finance your migration. Or even if you don't have these, if you have the networks, you would be able to migrate. But the oppressed castes very rarely have that. And there are some very interesting exceptions that tell us about how these some specific oppressed caste groups have actually been able to access migration, but predominantly not the kind of migration that again gives you social space and spatial mobility, but they have had access to migration where upward economic mobility is very fragile, that it could, you do make certain gains, but those gains could disappear with one event of, a huge health crisis or something like that. Now, an important aspect of this for why the oppressed castes from India have not been able to access international mobility is also state policy. India's emigration policy has been very oppressive and very, very repressive, I would say, towards the migration aspirations and the migration prospects of people with less education. And that is how it's classified in India. At present, people with less than 10 years of education who haven't finished school belong to one particular category, and that category is subject to severe restrictions, especially if you are women. But a distinction that I have found in my research is that when it involves international migration of people from the oppressed caste, there is an intersectionality that is quite different from that of the privileged caste. Among the oppressed castes who migrate internationally, you find that women are very visible. They are, or even a predominant group of them are women. So among the Dalits who migrate from a particular region in Andhra Pradesh, women are a predominant part. We don't have good statistics but my own investigation suggests that almost 60 to 70% of the migration from that region to the Middle East are of women. But as I said, they go in less paid jobs, mostly as domestic workers. And though they are able to earn better than they would earn here, but also they're able to escape the kind of caste inequality that prevails here. But in the Middle East, you have their own system of inequality, which they must then be part of. But that mobility that they achieve is extremely fragile. And therefore, another aspect of that migration is that it's to the Middle East, which again, migration is circular because there is no promise of ever getting away completely. You cannot become a citizen of the destination region, you have to return. And because their social endowments are low, they're unable to access migration to the OECD region, which upper caste people who go to the Middle East are actually able to use it as a transit to other regions of the world. I'll stop there and maybe take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pravina, for that. I do have a follow-up question, which is on intersectionality. I am going to ask it, but then I'm going to move, after I've asked you the question, to Nana, who has to leave in about 5 minutes. for some quick points from her, and then I will come back to you. But the question on intersectionality, because I also noted that you've done some work also on gender and child migration. And this is of course language that we're using even more and more to ensure inclusivity, and of course refers to the way that people to a way of seeing people's experiences as shaped by their race, their class, their gender, sexuality, all at the same time. So I'd like to hear from you how you think gender and age and any other intersectionality that you're looking into also plays out in the context of the caste the system and of migration in India. I'm going to go now, I'll leave you with that question for now, and I'm going to go to Nana now. And Nana, if you could just come back in, and I had raised a question, which was a question from Sylvia in the chat. And then, of course, I think any other final points as well that you would like to raise, because I know you've got about 5 minutes or 4 minutes to run off.
Okay, I'm going to try not to talk. I'm going to talk too quickly. So, I want to first of all, thank everyone. Thank you, Stella, and thank everyone that put this together. This has been fabulous. I'm so excited. I'm looking forward to what this is going to mean. This definitely cannot be the end of the journey, right? Where it's the beginning, and really excited to be on this journey with all of you. So the question was about Black collectives, about progressive organizations, NGOs, et cetera, and what the work is being done to attack extreme racism. And so I want to first say that we're looking at racism as extreme in and of itself, right? That there doesn't have to be some type of racism where people are wearing swastikas or they're carrying around Confederate flags. Clearly, that's not good. That's not what we're looking for. But it doesn't have to get to that point for us to be able to deal with it. And so we really are pushing for people to see racism as it's something that has a systemic nature. It's not about the individuals. It's not about Derek Chauvin and whether he is a racist. It's about the racism embedded in part and parcel of root of policing in the United States, right? And so that requires some research. It requires some education. I invite folks to go to Baji's website at baji.org, BAJI.org. We have a lot of reports on our website. We do this research, including our seminal report on the state of Black immigrants and a new report on the anti-Blackness experienced by Africans seeking asylum in the US, but forced to live in Mexico. And we do these reports so that we can have this information to dig into the systemic nature. As the president of NCBL, we are the lead organization in the International Commission of Inquiry on the Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the US, which is going to be released next week. Again, focusing on systemic violence. Systemic racism, excuse me. The next issue is, and I think it's one we don't talk about enough, and it's a whole thing in itself, addressing the anti-Black racism and other forms of racism within our social justice movements themselves and the organizations that are working in those movements. Because we're not going to get anywhere with trying to address racism in our communities, in our societies, if we can't address racism right at the tables where we're supposed to be working with each other against racism. It's not going to work. It's an uncomfortable conversation for people, but it's one that is critical to making any moves. And so those are the two areas in which, Baji does its work, in which we do our work with others, and areas that we're hoping that folks will be, that are here on this webinar, will be taking into the work that they're doing, not just pushing back against the racism in the society, but looking at our own organizations, right? And seeing and addressing and resolving the racism that we have internally.
Nana, thank you so much for that. And I think you're absolutely right, that it starts with us. It starts with our organizations. It starts from within our sector of also addressing these issues. And as you said, it is uncomfortable, but it does need to be talked about, critically so. Do you have one recommendation for us in relation to we're hoping that from these discussions, we can also identify some strategies or recommendations that we can take forward to the International Migration Review Forum, which is taking place next week. Sorry, next year, not next week. That'll be very soon. Next year.
Don't say that is very soon. I think that we really, yes, I think that we really need to look at this issue of how the anti-Black racism that comes out of this colonialism, imperialism, enslavement that we talked about, really look at how it, and be willing to focus on how it is embedded in our societies, and to have, bring more Black people to the table to have these conversations, right? We are everywhere. There's no place where there are not Black people. There's no area of migration in which we're not impacted. And yet, we're still sort of this small segment, in disproportionality to the big impact and disproportional impact that these policies have on us. So I would say bring more of us to the table and be open to having the conversations about how anti-Black racism expresses itself in the countries that we're from.
Great. Thank you so much, Nana. And thanks for your time and for staying till now. I know you have to go shortly. Really appreciate it. I know that I think Subir had some more questions for you, but I think if colleagues can share, as you had mentioned, the link to your website and perhaps to that of other speakers as well in the chat box, then the audience can also go and have a look at some of the materials that have been shared there. Thank you very much, Nana.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right. So I'm going to go right back to that final question that I had for Pravina. Before we go on to, we have one more speaker, so we'll go to Pravina very quickly, and then we will move on to Sylvia.
Thank you, Stella. I'd like to add one more point that I missed when I was speaking before I get to your question, and very quickly, that the reason for that exception why Dalit women have access to international migration from a particular region is that they had a prior history of migration to Burma in the pre-independence period. And in the pre-independence period, actually, Dalits did have access to migration because they probably had little to lose in going as indentured migration, because being of the oppressed caste, it was one form of oppression against another. So they were actually the bulk of those who went as indentured migration and also as free migrants to Burma and other places. And that gave them social capital. So that's just to conclude the earlier discussion that I was saying. Intersectionality and how does age and gender play out in the context of caste and migration in India? It's really a very, very important and also a very interesting issue, because there are two kinds of migration where children are involved. One is when they migrate with families, and the other is when they migrate alone, independently. And that is when they migrate independently, invariably it is in different forms of labor. Sometimes they're trafficked, but most of the time they actually are sent by their parents who are very poor. Now, when you look at the two, in fact, family migration occurs when families are extremely poor. And I'm talking about circular and seasonal migration. When families are extremely poor and they cannot afford to have just the breadwinning male migrate, which is the more prominent form of migration. Otherwise, the entire family needs to migrate. And there are certain occupations in which families migrate and child labor is also used, like sugarcane process work and also bricklins, etc. They actually use child labor. And here both boys and girls are used. There is a difference in terms of gender, where girl children are sometimes used when families migrate as construction labor. Girl children are used to take care of their younger siblings. So they perform the work that the mother would otherwise perform in the home. So there is fairly large scale in this segment, there is fairly large scale migration of children and child labor. We don't really have good estimates, but there is also child migration where children are now being put into school. In Kerala, for instance, when families migrate, there are programs in schools to attract these children to school. They're given breakfast, they're given lunch, which is usual in schools. There is a midday meal, but they're also given an additional breakfast in order to attract them. There are language sessions, but these these are not general. These are isolated programs which are interesting and which are good policy decisions that need to be replicated elsewhere in the country. But yes, gender and age do play out. They come together both in specific forms of migration of male children who are made to work in mines, in other forms of hard labor, in shops, etc. They're occupationally specific when children migrate independentally. Girls go, as young girls go, adolescent girls go and do domestic work. They stay with homes for long periods of time and do domestic work. Male children go to other kinds of sectors and usually go with intermediaries. So is that adequate, Stella?
Yes, no, that's absolutely brilliant, just in terms of, just bringing out some of the issues of what that actually looks like. And I think the points that you have strongly emphasized is, of course, the fact that it does have an impact on, well, it does mean that what you then have is child labor, essentially. But no, that was really useful, and thanks very much for that. I think it will be good to also, I think you had started perhaps to talk about some of what you've seen in terms of good practice around some of the language sessions you were saying, but other ways in which we can start to move things forward. But if you could just bear that in mind, and I'll come back to you at the end when we're wrapping up, just to get some quick points on all of that. So thanks very much, Pravina. And I'm going to move on now to our last speaker, who is Sylvia Rakeck. And Sylvia is the head of the Migration Axis. She's a Maya defender against gender violence, and coordinates the Migration Axis of the Popnoj Association. Has been doing this since June 2016. She has experience in Indigenous migrant children and women and girls in migration, and more specifically in the process of return and reintegration of migrant girls, boys, and adolescents deported from Mexico and the US. From a very young age, she's been involved in the Mayan women's social movements. She's an active part of the women's articulation of the Maya, and apologies for the pronunciation, Cachiquela's Alliance of Women to Prevent Gender Violence through the lens of her identity and culture. She has represented the Popnoj Association in different spaces at the national, regional, international level, publicizing the situation of the indigenous migrant childhood of Guatemala and the return and reintegration project that the association develops in Guatemala. Thanks very much for joining us, Sylvia, and it's really good to have someone who can actually talk to us as well about indigenous populations. And again, I will ask if you can also contextualize this for us just a little bit, and then perhaps share with us your own perspective on indigenous communities, racism and migration in Latin America and across borders. And then also in particular, why you think that racism is one of the root causes of the migration of the Mayan population of Guatemala.
Matios Chivachi Wanugel, Nabiek, Matios Shire Hafuma, Shehun Irmas Kakaslen, Kachkeri, Unakiri, Skian, Ronogel, Utilachin, Kakulkiri, Huakame, Matios Chivat. Buenos días, muchas gracias a todas y todos por este espacio. Agradecemos pues a las personas y a los organizadores de esta actividad por permitirnos compartir un poco pues acerca del tema del racismo y la discriminación. Creo que ya han compartido varias situaciones, ¿verdad?, en torno al racismo y la discriminación, y algo que creo que coincidimos y que es siempre necesario remarcar, que el tema del racismo es histórico y es estructural, ¿verdad? Se manifiesta en diferentes relaciones de poder, y esto específicamente en unos pocos, y esto ha hecho que nuestros medios de vida sean arrebatados, hemos sido oprimidos, ¿verdad? Los pueblos indígenas específicamente, digamos, toda Latinoamérica, hemos sido oprimidos, explotados, discriminados, y la mayoría, especialmente a nosotros los pueblos, ¿no?, por ser y pertenecer a comunidades indígenas. Algo interesante que me llamaba la atención en las intervenciones anteriores era que para la población negra eran conocidos como subhumanos, ¿verdad? Pero con el tema de la invasión, para justificar el despojo, el sometimiento y la explotación de los pueblos originarios, se desarrolló como el racismo y esa idea de que tenían que llamarnos, ¿no?, como indios, como una manera despectiva de referirnos a nosotros, las comunidades indígenas, y decir que ni siquiera que éramos subhumanos, sino que éramos animales, para tratarnos y ponernos a trabajar como animales. Entonces, y en otras literaturas encontramos de que éramos, no teníamos alma, ¿no? Entonces llegar a ese extremo de decir, bueno, pasar por diferentes situaciones, vulneraciones a derechos, ¿verdad? Porque no teníamos alma, entonces por ende, pues no había consideración contra los pueblos indígenas. Y luego vemos cómo a lo largo de la historia la población indígena ha sido sometida, orillada y excluida, ¿verdad? Entonces vivimos en condiciones de pobreza y pobreza extrema, para poner como el ejemplo más claro en Guatemala. Del 100% de la población, la pobreza afecta al 75% de la población indígena y un 36% a la población no indígena. Entonces vemos cómo también el tema de desnutrición afecta más a la población indígena y no así a la población no indígena. Entonces creo que es una muestra específica de cómo la discriminación y la exclusión de acceder a los servicios para tener una vida digna en los países de origen es una de las múltiples causas que genera la migración, porque pues los estados que son los encargados y responsables de garantizar una vida digna pues no nos brindan, ¿verdad? Y que las políticas no están encaminadas a atender específicamente a la población indígena. Y cuando en Guatemala más del 50% de la población somos indígenas, pero las estadísticas no lo muestran así, y por ende pues estas políticas no responden a atender nuestras necesidades, y esto es algo que hay que remarcar. Y a lo largo de la historia vemos cómo el racismo atenta con nuestras formas y prácticas de vida. Yo creo que en las diferentes culturas y cosmovisiones ha sido así, y se ha oprimido y se han apropiado de nuestros territorios, iniciando primero con nuestro cuerpo como territorio, ¿verdad? También limitan nuestro caminar, imponiendo leyes que violentan nuestras vidas, y algo que reconocemos como pueblos indígenas es que nos han dividido. Entonces, por eso nosotros decimos que desde nuestras formas de cómo vemos la migración, las fronteras que se han creado entre los países no han sido establecidos por los pueblos indígenas. Para los pueblos indígenas, la madre tierra es de todos y para todos. Entonces, estas fronteras se han establecido producto de esas relaciones de poder entre los poderosos. Entonces, esto ha determinado de que hay un mismo pueblo indígena dividido. Entonces, como ejemplo, la población mayamán dividido entre Guatemala y México, población chortí entre Guatemala y Honduras. Entonces, creo que eso es muy notorio, ¿verdad? De cómo se han ido construyendo y la ideología que hay en torno a la migración. También es necesario remarcar que la migración para nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, es necesario verlo desde ahí, ¿no? Desde la cosmovisión propia de nosotros los pueblos y los derechos de los pueblos, porque también son esos derechos los violentados durante todo el trayecto de la migración. Entonces, si en Guatemala siempre cuando vemos las noticias y dicen la mayoría de las personas que están saliendo, que están siendo deportadas, son indígenas o de comunidades indígenas de Guatemala. Entonces, ¿qué estamos haciendo para responder a las necesidades de esta población? Preguntándonos todas y todos, pero especialmente a los estados, ¿qué están haciendo? Si la mayoría de la población que está migrando es indígena, ¿qué está haciendo para atender las causas que están fomentando la migración de esta población? Y ya para hablar específicamente de cómo se vive la migración de las comunidades indígenas, creo que es necesario remarcar que una de las causas más comunes de las actitudes racistas en la migración puede encontrarse en el miedo que hay de las personas a lo diferente o a las personas que vienen de otros países, por desconocimiento o la falta de información de dónde venimos, de nuestras culturas, de nuestras prácticas de vida. Entonces nosotros no vamos a invadir, digamos, el territorio, sino nosotros estamos tratando de buscar mejorar nuestras condiciones de vida, porque en el país de origen, pues prácticamente nos está forzando a eso. Entonces, creo que también el tema, creo que lo he mencionado, pero hay que remarcar esto de que la apariencia racial y el origen étnico de las y los migrantes tienen un impacto significativo en toda la experiencia migratoria, tanto como dentro, digamos, cuando las personas se desplazan de manera interna y a nivel internacional, hay un mayor impacto, más aún cuando se trata de mujeres indígenas, porque como ya lo decía, el cuerpo como territorio es sometido a múltiples violaciones, ¿verdad? Todo lo que pasa a la persona migrante, pero se sufre más cuando se es mujer por, digamos, por la feminización, digamos, también de nuestros cuerpos y la idea que se tiene acerca del despojo, que es sinónimo de, sí, justamente eso, ¿no? El despojo y el saqueo que hay y que ha habido desde el tema de la invasión. Y aquí es necesario remarcar también el tema de la xenofobia, que siempre se menciona, ¿no?, en la migración, y que es específicamente contra los no nacionales y en particular contra los migrantes, que creo que es una de las principales causas del racismo. Entonces, creo que sí es importante evidenciar esta parte, ¿verdad?, que más que el odio al extranjero, la xenofobia es el miedo al migrante, que se cree que es una amenaza. Sin embargo, creo que ya lo mencionaron en las intervenciones pasadas, la evidencia, digamos, económica de que a mediano o largo plazo las personas migrantes tienen un efecto, digamos, positivo en los países de origen y de destino. Entonces, creo que sí es importante remarcar como eso de ver cómo nosotros vemos la migración desde nuestros territorios. Y algo específico ya para finalizar, creo que el tema de tener separar a las familias, hacerles firmar documentaciones sin saber su contenido y deportarlas sin darles la oportunidad de defenderse en sus idiomas, violenta todos sus derechos. Y en sí mismo esa es una expresión de discriminación, de racismo, y creo que constantemente las comunidades indígenas y específicamente de Guatemala somos sujetos de esas violaciones a no acceder y a defendernos en nuestros propios idiomas. Entonces yo creo que esa es una constante. El idioma es fundamental y creo que es una barrera que hay que también que hay que quitar, digamos, del imaginario y sobre todo que los estados también reconozcan las diversidades que hay a través de toda Latinoamérica y específicamente iniciando con los países de origen. Entonces, lo dejo por aquí. Gracias.
Sylvia, thank you so much for that, for those insights. I think once again, you know, just I think three things I've taken from what you've said. One was around that misinformation creates fear. And I think even in terms of doing that, you also basically just highlighted for us, you know, the percentage of indigenous populations versus the non-indigenous populations, and yet the fact that fewer people within the indigenous communities have access to services. And also the fact that actually a lot of people are not even aware that the population of the indigenous populations are actually much greater than they are actually put out there. And so I think the points that you make around misinformation creating fear, and therefore even enhancing the lived experiences of people who are impacted, you know, by racism is particularly important. And then I think another point as well that you raised, which I think has also come through the earlier discussions, has been very much around the social and economic policies not supporting the realities of people. Again, I think someone had mentioned this earlier. And then, of course, I think the fact that, you know, you also mentioned that language is also absolutely fundamental in how, in relation to the indigenous communities, the issue of language and people basically being forced to sign things that they don't quite understand is also an impact of these, or is a consequence of these inequalities that we see. I wondered if, and I'm very mindful of the time, I have one question for you, and I hope you can throw a bit of light of that in just a couple of minutes. And then I see a hand up. Vijay has got his hand up. So once you have responded to my next question, we will bring Vijay in Hopefully, Vijay, you can make your comment or question in 1 minute so that I can take on some more questions as well, and then also get back to the speakers. So my question for you was, and you touched on this briefly, Sylvia, which was on gender. So again, I'm looking at intersectionality again, and we've seen some tensions and discussions between those who fear that a focus on intersectionality rather than looking specifically at issues of race and ethnicity might actually take away from the urgency of race and ethnicity. How do we, from what you've been working on, how do we successfully marry up what I call isms of intersectionality so that our strategies going forward are crystal clear, they're concrete, they're solid and achievable?
Sí, yo creo que es importante, como de nuevo lo menciono, el tema del racismo y la discriminación es está arraigado y es parte de este sistema. Pero creo que dentro de esto y hablando específicamente del tema de mujeres, creo que hay que enfocarlo, como lo decía anteriormente, ver específicamente desde la cosmovisión de los pueblos, digamos, el hecho de por qué están saliendo de las comunidades, pero también reconocer esa diversidad que hay desde el país de origen y la diversidad que hay después de que las personas lleguen digamos, al país de destino, porque, digamos, se sufren diferentes situaciones y en diferentes espacios de la migración, no solo en el origen. Entonces, y para el tema de las mujeres, para poner como ejemplo más específico, cuando una mujer migra, tiene que despojarse de su identidad para poder migrar. Entonces, ¿por qué? Porque se tiene, digamos, el tema de discriminación también muy arraigado y esto, algo que quizás no se ve o no se menciona en la migración, tiene que dejar de hablar su idioma, dejarse de vestir, digamos, su indumentaria. Entonces, y esto, y algo que no se ve es ese impacto que genera emocionalmente en la vida de esa persona que siempre ha vivido y despojarse de lo que es. Creo que es importante tomar en cuenta esto y qué tenemos que hacer para enfrentar todo esto. Creo que el camino es, y lo decimos, uno no nace también siendo racista, uno no nace siendo discriminador. Creo que esto se va aprendiendo y es algo que nosotros mencionamos, ¿verdad? Es algo que se va replicando a través de todo lo que vemos y sobre todo, y aquí quiero remarcar también el tema de que los principales y los primeros que están violentando y generando la migración también son esos estados racistas y discriminadores que atentan, digamos, también con la soberanía de los pueblos. Entonces creo que ahí es necesario que se dejen de estar desarrollando estos discursos de odio, discursos racistas que quizás siempre se han dado, ¿verdad? De cómo los estereotipos específicos acerca de las personas migrantes y sobre todo especialmente de las mujeres. Creo que en el tema de género es bastante amplio, pero remarcar algo que siempre, en todos los niveles, el tema de género siempre se ha llevado y termina siempre en cuanto al tema del trabajo doméstico. Entonces, en la migración lo vemos muchísimo más. Cuando la mujer sale de su comunidad, está siendo sometida, el tema de la violencia de género, y cuando llega el trabajo, al único trabajo que puede aspirar es al trabajo doméstico. Entonces, yo creo que aquí también es necesario pensar, ¿verdad? El tema de la ideología que se tiene de la mujer migrante. Entonces, y a todas las situaciones que es sometida durante el trabajo, lo que ya se mencionaba, ¿verdad? Las largas horas de trabajo, de jornadas, y que no es la remuneración igualitaria, también ahí se ve, se le paga más al hombre y no así a la mujer, y en este caso también a familias que viajan, por ejemplo, a México, que son guatemaltecas, se reconoce el trabajo del hombre, pero no se le paga a la mujer, y si van en familia, tampoco se reconoce el trabajo de los niños. Entonces, creo que es necesario que los estados específicamente, si no atienden específicamente esas causas de raíz y dentro de esas causas, el tema del racismo y la discriminación, porque dentro de eso, digamos, se disfraza también esa parte de que no están atendiendo las necesidades de la población y más que atenderlas, son los estados que están generando que la población salga o se desplace de sus comunidades. Entonces, y para las comunidades indígenas, dejar la tierra y el territorio no es nada fácil porque hay un arraigo específico con la tierra. Entonces creo que es fundamental plantearnos todos estos retos, ¿verdad? De que cómo combatir el tema del miedo que hay hacia la persona extranjera. Y esto me lleva muchas veces a que, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos nos dicen, pero ¿por qué están migrando las personas indígenas? Entonces hay diferentes situaciones, diferentes causas que están generando, y no solo es el tema económico, muchas veces reducen la causa de la migración con mejorar condiciones de vida o el incremento económico, pero hay muchísimas otras violencias que pasan a raíz, digamos, y alrededor y en torno a esto, y dentro de esto aquí también quiero mencionar el tema de despojo de tierra que hay en las comunidades indígenas, específicamente en Guatemala, a causa de las minerías y las hidroeléctricas y grandes industrias que hay. Creo que también es lo que está generando la migración en la región.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Thanks for that input. I'm aware that we are very quickly running out of time with all these very interesting discussions. So what I will do is I'd like to circle back to the other speakers who had spoken earlier, just for some quick points from them. I understand Pravina needs to leave shortly. So Pravina, I'm going to come back to you. This was really a session at this point where we wanted to start to look at strategies to move things forward, and also any recommendations that we would like to make or would like to take forward for the International Migration Review Forum, and also for ourselves as well. So I'm just going to pass on to you for any words. And also if there's anything in the chat that you wanted to respond to as well, please do feel free to do that.
Thank you, Stella. I'm so sorry, but we've got a curfew that has been imposed because of the coronavirus. So I need to rush. I have to get home. It takes me half an hour. So strategies as far as international migration and women are concerned, there's a great deal that our state could do, which it really is not doing. I'm talking specifically about poorly educated women. If only it was less restrictive, if it had fewer bureaucratic controls, if there was more credible information, if the state were to reach out in credible ways to these to the source regions of migration and spread credible information, but also back this up with certain kind of social security measures, insurance, but most importantly, skills training and language education, which would really make a huge difference in terms of their rating on the market in the Middle East. And that, I think, is very important, because Filipino women actually do very well because they're rated very well on the market. So their minimum wages are much higher than that of Indian workers, despite the fact that Indian workers were in the Middle East, Indian domestic workers were in the Middle East almost a decade before the Filipino workers arrived there. And the Filipino workers are far better known, far better skilled, far better reputed than them. And this is because of the kind of policy that the Indian state has pursued. So skilling is very important. Even in terms of skilling and language education, we have a large number of women who have returned from the Middle East, who speak the kind of Arabic that is what those who want to go now need to learn. So, it's a question of actually endowing those women, or giving them the kind of respect that they deserve for the time that they have worked there, by making them teachers. But of course, we need to actually develop methodologies, because they're not ready-made teachers. We need to develop methodologies and then include them in this whole process. And that could be quite empowering. But then the state again needs to be far more proactive in the Middle East. And the Filipino state has shown that you can be proactive in the protection of the workforce, despite the hostility of the kafala system over there. The Indian state does far less than it is possible to do. And the Indian state, India has a population in the Middle East that is larger than the population of many of those countries. And it has far fewer outreach centers than the Philippines, which is a much smaller country. So there's much that India can do, and especially much that India can do to empower these women workers, because these women workers are already supporting their families. They lack recognition. They are losing out on the gains of migration because of the lack of skills and because of the lack of policy support. As far as migration within the country is concerned, and the question that you asked me about gender and age, again, far little is being done. And this is within the country. It's our own citizens. And when they move from one state to another, it's almost like you're going from one country to another. They don't have, now we have started to introduce portability of ration cards, which will give you a modicum of food security. But then when only one member of the family migrates, the ration card has to be with the family. So you will still not have food security. We need social security. Kerala and Tamil Nadu are far ahead of other states in terms of these kind of protections for migrant workers who come to these states. They give, it's very minimal, but they do give accident insurance. They do give health insurance, very small. Tamil Nadu does this better than Kerala, but Kerala also does this. And then there are innovative school schemes. I spoke about the midday meal and also the teaching of language, which is very important for inclusion within the societies in the destination states. But these really need to gain momentum, and we really need to pay much more attention than we have in this country towards internal migration. We have more internal migrants within our country than people going out, because it's such a large country and we have so many people who are really survival migrants, and this is just increasing, it's not decreasing. And we also need to, of course, create conditions in the source regions that will make migration a choice rather than a survival strategy. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Praveen. I think that was really important and really powerful. And I think some of what you said will also resonate for sure in other regions, in other countries. The fact that there are more internal migrants in country than there are migrants who actually travel beyond. And I think that's the case for most countries, really. And of course, having social, policies that ensure inclusion for everyone does need to be on our radar as well when we're talking about race and migration. So thank you so much for that, input. And I hope you make it home. You make it home quickly. I had it, I care for you. Thank you. I'm now just going to go to a question so we're just wrapping up now, and I'm picking up some of the questions in the chat box. I'm going to come to you, Anastasia, in relation to the earlier question or input that Patricia had made, which I'd mentioned. And then there's also a question from Helena in the chat where she says, I wonder how we can best articulate a racial and ethnic discrimination movement. I'm concerned that we're focused on our own realities and our particular challenges, failing to adopt a wider perspective. So it'd be good to hear your just some quick insights into that in a couple of minutes or so. You're on mute at the moment, Anastasia.
It's happening. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry, Patricia, I didn't exactly hear your question, but I'll try to answer it anyway without properly hearing it. First of all, in terms of the last question, look, I think it's really important that we frame this understanding of race and ethnicity and migration and racism around a very clear understanding, which I think Nana spoke to very, very clearly, about racism as being structurally embedded, institutionally present, and then experienced by people. If we don't do that, we have no starting point. Secondly, I think we need a very clear rights-based starting point. And for framing our discussion, I think the ICER, the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, what else would I say, is not unhelpful, because it talks about all forms of racial discrimination. And I think that's where we need to start from. I believe it to be really important, as indeed Nana has pointed out, that we acknowledge the extreme significance of colonialism and slavery. But moving, and I have had some solidarity work over the years with Roma and travellers in Europe, Europe, for example, I'm very conscious of the very explicit forms of racism experienced by Roma and travellers over the year in this country, in my own, and in Europe. And we spell travellers with a capital T, sorry people, over the years and over the centuries. In Roma, it was permissible to kill Roma up to a couple of centuries ago in Europe. So this is a very explicit form of racism. And can I say, thirdly, then, the type of, we need to go beyond language, you know, we need to go beyond this language of balance. I was reminded of it when Aldi was talking about those common basic principles, which talked about your responsibility and my responsibility and their responsibility. I mean, if we're talking about rights, we have to talk about rights realization and creating the conditions where people can live as human beings, and then beginning to look at what might be associated with it, instead of assuming that before any rights are realized, a certain amount of responsibilities have to be gone along with. Fourthly, let me say, I think language is important. I do feel that that language of integration into what? Into something owned by who? And I feel in our discussions, and as you formulate your agenda as well, that we need to be very careful of this sort of language. And then when we talk about intersectionality and race and ethnicity, yes, you're right, there could be dangers in intersectionality, because intersectionality can become a way of throwing everything into the middle and nothing comes out the far end. We know very explicitly as women, whatever our backgrounds, we know that unless we name things, they can't be addressed. But I do think intersectionality is important in naming the intersection. For example, in CERD, I was very conscious at one stage of the way in which LGBTI people in certain parts of Europe, for example, were very easily denied asylum in asylum-seeking processes, you know. So there was no other way of calling it except that there was an intersectionality there between racism and racism and gender. So I think we need to be very, very careful to name those things. Then let me say, I think we need to think about where we're coming from and where we want to go to. And that's where I feel there are things we can do that are small, about procedures, the experiences that people have. It's accurate to say there's no country in the world that actually allows everyone to be a citizen. But I think if we keep using the language of citizens and privilege citizens over residents, then we're never going to address institutional racism. We're certainly never going to address the intersection between race, ethnicity, and migration. And that's very much an issue. And it's not just an issue in Europe. I think it's also an issue if you look to the conversations that colleagues have been having about the Middle East and about Asia and about other parts of the world also. And then can I say, I think as well that though and I better stop then or you'll drive me off the platform, Stella, but I feel as well that we need to be careful around the intersectionality with class. You know, we need to be careful not to, sort of privilege as women. We can be fairly clear that what the women's movement made some mistakes in doing was privileging white middle-class women over and above women from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and Black women. But not only white women, but also women of a particular class. And I say then, I think there are three sorts of strategies that we can adopt. And they do relate to things like health, education, accommodation, employment, social welfare, and discrimination. There are small changes in procedures. You know, how do people experience the lack of translation? That doesn't require any legislative change to do something about it. What can we do about policies? And then the big struggle, which I've been trying to talk about for the last 5 minutes, about moving our perception of things. And that does require particular moves from people like myself, who may have experienced racism at one stage, but would now be very easily perceived as an old white woman well past her date. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. I think you have a rich experience there in history in this work, so we would definitely be taking your points on board for sure. I think I think you made some really key points there, and I've made a note of all of them as well, around language, intersectionality, and also I think the point you made around, if we continue to use language like citizens versus, like residents, and even much more broadly, within the work that we do, we talk about the developing countries and developed countries and underdeveloped and all of those things. And these are all things that we need also to be mindful about. So thanks very much for sharing your points with us, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to move on very quickly now to Adler, who hasn't had a chance to make her her final comments. And I think there was a question as well that I had raised specifically for you. I'm aware as well, everyone, that we are over time, but we will be wrapping up shortly. In the next 5 minutes, we should be able to wrap up then. Adla, over to you. You're on mute at the moment.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can hear you now.
Perfect. Okay, regarding the question, I have already answered it in the chat, so that we skip some of the time. I fully agree with Anastasia in terms of the issue of language, but I believe that we should first agree between the civil society organization and activists on which terms we will use. And also in each country, the terminology changes, and some of us are not really good in English language, so we are using terms that are more focused in the national essays and reports. So sorry if I misused some of the terminology. Coming back to the European Pact on Migration, we see that the Commission chooses to prioritize return and migration prevention. So we're still reviewing that, and we will soon propose specific solutions through the networks that we participate in. I again point out that we should be committed to our request for safe passage to Europe, safe passage for refugees, and a guarantee of the rights and fair treatment by all EU member states. I wish to thank everyone in this panel for their interesting inputs, and I hope that we can continue to collaborate in order to address these problems. But also I urge you that this can happen when we have support and solidarity, at least for us, for grassroots organizations, from international and European equities and from international and European networks, because only then our governments will feel the pressure to change and revise their politics. Let's not forget that our accountability lies in people's recognition of our work, our effort, and the results. It lies in the recognition of the migrants on behalf of whom we speak. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address all these issues. And I'm at your disposal.
Thank you very much, Adla, but very important words. It's about the reality of the migrants, pretty much. They are the heart of all of this. And we do need to take that into consideration, of course. And, you know, that has to be the starting point. Thank you. I will now go to Sylvia for a final word from you, Sylvia. And also there was a point that was made in the chat box. We've only got, you've only probably got about a minute, Sylvia, to respond. But there was a point in the chat raised by Evelyn. She said it would be very interesting to hear more from you on linguistic discrimination, since in the US, there's often not translation in indigenous languages when people arrive. So I think if you can respond to that very, very briefly, and then your final words in terms of a recommendation or a strategy that we can take forward.
Gracias. Sí, yo para responder eso en menos de un minuto o más de un minuto, creo que algo importante que hay que pensar es que los estados, por ejemplo, en Guatemala, se debe de hablar de la migración analizada y comprendida desde la cosmovisión de los pueblos indígenas. Y esto, digamos, porque para nosotros los pueblos el tema de migración, y esto es importante, no constituye para nosotros la migración como un problema, o sea, no lo vemos como un problema, sino siempre ha sido como una oportunidad de intercambio entre pueblos, con relación al comercio, de crecimiento, de apoyo mutuo, como parte de la reciprocidad, digamos, uno de los valores fundamentales, y creo que siempre le apuntamos, y esto de todos los pueblos de Abya-Yala, el buen vivir. Entonces, la migración siempre ha abierto la posibilidad de comunicarnos entre las comunidades y entre los pueblos, para empezar. Y creo que el tema del idioma es uno de los grandes temas que siempre se han discutido, y en Estados Unidos hay muy pocas organizaciones, y cabe mencionar que son organizaciones de sociedad civil los que están haciendo el trabajo para interpretación a cortes para que las personas tengan un debido proceso, ¿verdad? Porque antes de ser deportados y saber, digamos, la sentencia de un juez, incluso para los niños y las niñas, ¿verdad? Su corta edad, el poder expresar y decir el por qué está ahí, las causas de la migración es fundamental, y creo que para eso es necesario que no solo en Estados Unidos, sino en todas las fronteras, se tenga esta posibilidad, ¿verdad? De que las personas se puedan expresar en su idioma. Entonces yo creo que hay muchísimo camino por recorrer solo con este tema del idioma, que creo que habría que hacer otro webinar para hablar solo sobre esto, pero creo que es necesario mencionar esta parte porque también creo yo que los sentimientos arraigados históricamente sobre los migrantes ha hecho que las personas no puedan acceder a estos servicios, ¿verdad? Y sobre todo algo tan esencial que es el idioma. Entonces yo creo que sí es importante poder hacer llegar como este mensaje y seguir discutiendo en torno al racismo, la discriminación, específicamente porque creo que se hablan de las violaciones en general, pero no las llamamos como tal, como racismo, como discriminación, y creo que también hay que empezarlo a hablar y mencionar como tal, porque creo que esto es algo que se hace constantemente y en todo el trayecto de la migración. Entonces aquí también integramos a los países de origen, que también están dentro y son parte de este racismo que se sigue replicando. Entonces yo quiero terminar pues agradeciendo este espacio, que creo que también seguir sumando y reflexionando en torno a esto que nos está afectando, y creo que, como lo decía, podemos acabar y combatir la discriminación y el racismo, y creo que es uniéndonos todas y todos, pensando y dejando y aprendiendo del otro también, ¿verdad? Porque si no conocemos de dónde viene el otro o la otra, pues fácilmente caemos en el tema de la negación o el rechazo. Entonces yo creo que invitar pues a conocernos dentro de las diversidades que habemos en todo el mundo. Muchísimas gracias.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think you hit the nail on the head there at the very start, where you said that you do not see migration as a problem. It is actually an opportunity. And that's where the narrative and changing the narrative also starts. And that's the work that we need to be doing. Thank you so much for your input, much appreciated. Just to say at this point, we have run out of time. Thanks everyone for all your questions and comments in the chat box. Apologies if we couldn't get to all the questions, but we have taken a note of them and also of the suggestions and points that had been made in the chat box as well. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Anastasia, to Nana, to Adla, to Pravina, and to Sylvia for your very rich input today, and for taking the time to share that with us. I think this is just the beginning, as we said, and we will be taking this forward. And at this point, I will pass on to Colin to wrap this up for us.
Wow, thank you so much, Stella. That was incredible. I promised that we had special announcements, and I promised that this would be a reward for those who stayed on this long. So I'll just take 1 or 1.5 quick minutes to do that. Just to, first of all, remind everyone that this is the second in the series that we have, that we've just kind of, Martina, my colleague, is flashing up on screen. We are taking a break next week. We're taking a break to catch up with a number of organizing things we need to do. And then we'll reconvene in 2 weeks' time, exactly 2 Tuesdays from today, on the 4th of May. We will be looking at regular pathways and irregular migration. We will then follow up that the week after that on the 11th of May with looking at detentions and returns. And then the final one immediately after that, a week after that, on the 18th of May, on climate change and migration. So this is the series. We've just finished the second one. We have 3 more after a break next week. So next week's a break, and then 3 weeks in May, on the 4th of May, the 11th of May, and 18th of May, back to back. So please make a note of that. The other thing that we just want to announce really quickly is that we're about to launch a dedicated website online platform for this series, and not just this series, but this whole process of what comes after this, the webinars and the discussions, with all the collections of summaries, the recordings in all the language. Everything will be collectivized in this online platform. So we'll be announcing that very, very soon. Please keep a lookout for that in your emails, and we'll definitely, when we come back in 2 weeks' time, we'll be flashing that and showing you that full space where we hope to support the building of this movement and the civil society priorities by collectivizing all the information and outcomes in there. Where do we go as a follower? As Nana said, this cannot be the end, and absolutely not. This is just the beginning. We have so much more. We've covered so much today, and with so much more to unpack, so much more to dive deeper into. And Helena's point about how do we build a movement? Where's the actions that we need to take collectively, as globally as possible? Where do we go from this? What we're proposing is that in 8 weeks' time, so after the series ends, we'll take another week break. And then in 8 weeks' time, in the beginning of June, we will come back. We will invite all the panelists back from all the series and discuss all of the action items that we've gone through and that we've discussed so far. And we will open up the discussion region by region. So everyone who participated in this series, everyone will get a chance to talk about and reflect on the action items, particularly from your viewpoint, particularly from your communities, from your movement, from your networks where you're experiencing that. So we will come back to have that very, very thorough civil society discussion, a very open discussion, and good reflections from the panelists in terms of what they're hearing from everyone as well. So we're still working out the mechanics for that, but stay tuned for that. But make a note of it. It will be in 8 weeks' time in the beginning of June. With that said, we want to, again, thank you, everyone. I want to say a big thank you to Stella for moderating this, for all the work you've done preparing for this. Stella, big thanks to you. Thanks to all our speakers for today. Really, really appreciate the time you've taken out and the conversations and the deep discussions you've been doing here, but also for your ongoing work. We very much appreciate that. And also a big thank you to our co-organizers who are organizing this series, to the ad hoc working group on race and migration and the action committee who've been sort of leading this discussion around race, racism and discrimination in migration. And a big thank you to our hardworking interpreters today and every webinar series. We thank you very much. Again, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks' time. Thank you all.